What I'm asking physicians to do is to realize that something's wrong. Something's really wrong.
One of the biggest heartbreaks for me came when that feeling that I am just in some system and that I am basically a very elaborately trained technician of the body that is commoditized. Dr. Drea Burbank, an MD technologist and serial entrepreneur, really applying high-tech interventions to critical sectors to solve really society's challenging problems with a techno-optimistic approach. And if anyone exemplifies neurodivergence, and she just called it lateral thinking, more than her, I can't think of that person.
Doctors are 100% victimized right now. I have nothing but compassion for clinicians, especially with COVID and the way the industry is going. They're being overworked. They're being shamed whenever they fall short.
We have an increasingly sick society filled with excess, physicians burning out, struggling to keep patients healthy. Our patients are increasingly more comorbid, usually with chronic disease.
I totally believe doctors are resilient and brilliant, and they love their patients and they love their work, and we will find a way to do it.
Okay, we have another amazing episode of the Alchemy of Politics. I'm your host, Dr. Rusha Modi, a physician here in Los Angeles. And the mission of this show, as always, is to talk to the smartest, most creative people solving society's most wicked problems. And today we have an extra special guest, one I'm truly honored and excited to talk to, Dr. Drea Burbank, an MD technologist and serial entrepreneur, really applying high-tech interventions to critical sectors to solve really society's challenging problems with a techno-optimistic approach. And if anyone exemplifies neurodivergence, and she just called it lateral thinking, more than her, I can't think of that person. So thank you, Dr. Burbank, for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
So I wanted to kind of get into it with how physicians engage with technology and how that's impacted the doctor-patient relationship. And you really kind of lit the internet on fire, especially with Twitter, with a couple of recent, essays talking about really some fairly controversial notions. So the traditional thinking has been, it's a death by 1,000 clicks for most physicians. That's certainly true for a lot of us. And most physicians feel like, this was put upon me, and this is something that the system created that I have really no leverage over. But that's where you disagree. I mean, you've basically argued that, at least in part, physicians are somewhat culpable in this sort of golden prison, I guess, that we might call it, of having to interact with fairly clunky, non-user-friendly software systems like Epic. So do you mind explaining exactly how are we all to understand our role in creating this sort of EMR nightmare that most physicians find themselves in?
Yeah, it is a nightmare. I will completely agree. I worked in a hospital with paper charts. As a busy med student resident, you do a lot of the charting, and I work with paper charts and I work with a body EMR. And I will say I'd take a paper chart over a body EMR any day, just because of my time and the cognitive pain of working with the bad structure. So yeah, it is definitely 1,000 clicks. I think the problem kind of goes back. So first off, not all specialties have abdicated technology. Some specialties have really adopted it and they've benefited financially. So in particular, diagnostic radiology and also ophthalmology are heavily embedded, integrated, and involved in the development of their own technology. Those are fairly heavy tech specialties. I don't know if every specialty could do it, but I've seen neurosurgery be pretty good with it as well. So it is possible, and some physicians and disciplines are doing it, and their pocketbooks are showing it. Also, I believe, I didn't have this opinion at first. I was working in a hospital with paper charts with really good clinicians, an amazing system, and we had a DOS-based EMR that was introduced. And I thought, wow, this is awful. I could definitely do better. So I started to design a visual interface because I was playing Plants and Zombies on my iPad at the time. And I
Mm.
thought, oh, you could just make a plants and zombies for medicine. And I could just, put things what I'm doing. I don't have to chart anything. I don't have to put any words in there. And the tech was out there, and I thought this would be easy. It's not easy tech to build, but it's not impossible. I think what I found was that there's this massive wall between medicine and technology. So the minute I started talking about technology in the hospital, the clinicians that I so loved and who I thought I was advocating for were offended. They didn't want to talk about it. This is not what we do. We're clinicians. And then when I got a bee in my bonnet and I went and did it anyway. And when I tried to come back, they said the same thing. They said, you've abandoned medicine. You're not doing medicine anymore. We don't want you back. And I had loving conversations with hundreds of physicians because I applied 2 years running in both the US and Canada. So nearly every specialty. And almost every specialty, pathology, family medicine, surgery, orthopedics, plastics, everybody said, what are you doing in relevance to medicine when you launched a telemedicine app for 67,000 physicians? How did that have anything to do with your job as a doctor? And I thought, oh my God, this is brutal. This belief that it's external when every other industry on earth is having to commercialize. And just comparing it to other disciplines that are so human. So like if you look at the military, for instance, it's a very human infrastructure, and it's a very serious infrastructure. And yet the attitude of the military towards medicine is, they have their own incubators and they beg high-tech founders to come and work with them. And then they make them get serious. And if they're not serious, they don't get funded. So I just don't see that happening in medicine.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And, just to piggyback on something that you just mentioned, I mean, I just went through a credentialing process for a hospital just fairly recently. And, there was a gap of like 2 weeks in just transition between various positions and when I was training versus going into, clinical research roles. And, they jumped all over that. What were you doing in that time period? Was it really 2 weeks? What was going, did you see patients? I'm like, I didn't lose clinical skills in like 2 weeks. So there is this sort of bizarre notion that if you step away for even a second from anything 100% clinical, that, okay, they got to get all over that, which is a bizarre notion. And yeah, I think also there may be sometimes an honest desire to protect patients. No one is disputing that. But in a lot of cases, it's like the system really trying to impress upon you through subtle coercion, hey, you can't leave this setup that generates so much money for the rest of us by your labor. So when I heard that part of your story, I was sort of like, wow, that's so unfortunate. But I also thought this was sort of the start of your hero's journey, to use sort of a Campbell mythology. Like, you are literally in the Amazon right now, and you've done all these proverbial journeys, and you're kind of like bringing back those insights for slaying those dragons to the rest of us that really haven't kind of like, either been asked or forced to take that kind of journey. So I thought that was, the background resonance of sort of a superhero's sort of origin story, if you will. So I know that must have been very challenging at the time, but I think we need techno optimists that really understand technology for that. So thank you on that. The second notion in this sort of thesis that you have that I thought was initially really quite out there, but the more that I'm sitting with it, I'm like, no, she has a real point, is you actually want like a class action lawsuit or a litigation using sort of cognitive repetitive work strain as the basis to, and I'm a fairly literate person, but I was like, I can't tell through this essay, or maybe I'm just dumb. Like, is there a level of satire? Are you being serious? And if so, why litigation
Absolutely.
as opposed to some other form of organizing?
Yeah. So I started to think about it. So first of all, I love these clinicians that treat me. And so I was like, if there's something wrong with this person, why do they think so deeply that technology is dangerous to their profession and that it's going to hurt them? And it was hurting them. And it has hurt them more since this all happened. So I started to think, what's the actual root cause? And the more I looked at it, the more I started to see that doctors like have this huge economic industry that's doing this to them. It's controlling their external structure to such a degree, like on such a deep level. Because after I went into like med tech consulting, and I worked for a lot of different companies in and out of the hospital. So I would go all the way from like the boardroom with like insurance companies, down through like med tech device salespeople into the OR working with the clinician and back out. So I started to see this kind of like bubble that was forming around an individual physician where they're super isolated. Their workplace is they're surrounded by people who are all kind of watching them and controlling them. And I know that sounds super like, sorry, that sounds a little surveillance state. But the fact is that economically, physicians function as a cog in a very elaborate engine. And the parameters of that engine are known and measured. And basically, the more pressure you can put on the cog, the engine functions. But the engine is currently designed to function on behalf of large conglomerates. And during this period, I did a year with tobacco control. And I worked with Stan Glantz, who's one of the leading people in the fight against tobacco control. And I heard all the ins and outs of how this whole fight shaped up. And it started to sound so much like the same thing. And the biggest takeaway that I got from it, and Stan was very adamant about this, when you have a for-profit industry that profits from disease, the only way to treat the disease, in this case it was lung cancer, is to regulate the industry. And it wasn't until doctors were talking about lung cancer for years and years and years before they regulated tobacco. But it wasn't until they regulated tobacco that they had the public health victory, which is arguably the biggest victory in the 50 years in all of the 21st century.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say that that's kind of interesting. So, what might the scope of that sort of litigation look like? And do you think is that the one sort of question mark I had is, can we make a direct through line between the specific technological features or maybe lack thereof of an Epic or a Cerner or whatnot between some of the professional challenges and personal burnout and injuries that a lot of physicians argue for? I mean, if I'm Judy Faulkner and I'm the CEO of Epic, I'm going to say, look, there's a trillion reasons why a physician is having challenges with, taking care of patients the way he or she would feel comfortable doing. And you can't point to our system alone as the sole or even primary reason. So I feel like, do you think that that would be an argument that we would have a response to if this litigation would go? I mean, they could point to like 20 other things, like, why aren't you suing that company and this and that and the insurance and the payer system and, the federal government? Like, why pick on Epic?
It's so easy. That's why, because there's a huge body of work in UX. So it's a user experience research. So in human computer interface design, which is HCI design, UX is how your interface interacts with your cognition. There's a ton of evidence, like a huge body of work. How many buttons you can put on the screen for a human, how those buttons need to signal if you press them, like just basic monkey stuff. Like at the end of the day, I love all doctors and I am one, but we're still kind of chimpanzees, and there's some limits to our cognitive horizon and to our ability to perceive information on a screen. And those limits are so well defined that there's no argument about them in any of the industry. I think I put in my article out a link to Google's public interface where they just go through all the different rules, and Epic's interface violates every single one of them, like on so many levels. It's horrendous, really, honestly. For a computer designer to look at any modern EHR, we just throw up our hands and we go, I don't know how this made it onto the market, because it would never make it onto a consumer market. I mean, you've got an Apple Watch on your hand and we're talking on Zoom, and I see two buttons on my screen. Why does a physician have 200 elements on their screen that just see, for instance, you don't put two nav bars on the screen. You never put more than one. That's just a basic HDI rule. And we don't even talk about it in commercial tech anymore. But if you look on an EHR, I've seen as many as 3 nav bars and 2 menu bars. Yeah. And the number of clicks that it takes to get a job done, all that's well proven. So it is death by 1,000 clicks. That's not an exaggeration, and it's entirely outside of industry standards. There's something called technical debt. So when a system like Epic contracts with a hospital to put Epic into the hospital, they put the minimum viable product, the minimum amount they can get in that actually works, that's safe. Then they owe a technical debt. So yes, they owe a debt to refine the product. And none of these companies are fulfilling their technical debts. There's actually like monetary value in most, like when you commission commercial software, there's monetary value on how polished the interface needs to be at the end of it. And I don't think these companies ever will, which is why I'm advocating for legal action. And I'm not advocating for legal action in the sense that we're going to punish people, we're going to charge them a bunch of money. I'm advocating legal action in the sense that these guys shouldn't own the interface.
Yeah.
Why do they have the access to doctors' minds?
I mean, the more I sit with that idea, the more I feel like you make a comment in one of the essays, effectively stating that like the language, the lexicon of law, of litigation, of money is really the only thing that companies like that understand. And all the hand wringing and complaining and sort of professional commiserating will only get us so far. If that's the only language we understand, we're going to have to speak in that language. I wanted to kind of get into something. I want to quote actually a wonderfully intelligent and fantastic doctor, you, in one of these pieces. So you said, doctors are smart, compassionate people who are overwhelmed and guilty of willful blindness when it comes to technology. They have abdicated the responsibility for the design and development of technology to non-clinical professions, then externalize their frustrations with the consequence of this professional decision. So I thought that was probably the most compelling sort of paragraph in those two essays. And I wanted to see, just gently push back. Do you feel like there's a little victim shaming there? Do you feel like there's
Oh, totally.
hey, because I know a lot of physicians that are like, you know what? I'll tell you a very quick story before I let you answer that question. I remember my pre-med advisor at college, and I was a sophomore, so I'm 19 at the time. And I'm going through all the, organic chemistry and this or that. And he talks to me, he's looking over my application. I'm asking him questions like how to apply. He's like, so are you burnt out yet? And this is a guy that had been doing this for like 40 years, right? He had been deep into pre-med advising. And I sort of like, I didn't know how to answer. I thought it was a test. I was like, oh, is he recording my answer to this? Whatever. So I was like, oh no, but like, yeah, it was a profoundly difficult time for me. And then he was like, and he's like, I tell all my, med school applicants, like, if you are going to take a gap year or go find yourself or do anything different, you should do it before you start med school, because at that point, you'll never be able to get off that train. And then he goes in detail to describe every step of the process, from pathophysiology to your clinicals to then whatever, and then your intern year. And he's like, it'll be too hard to get off. You did get off, and you had suffered some consequences for that. So, a lot of doctors would say, I mean, I busted my ass just to get into college, and then I had to compete with pre-med gunners who were killing the curve. And then I had to take the MCAT, and then I'm going through med school. I have science up to my earballs, eyes, and then I got to do all this training clinically or postgraduate education, keeping up with all this. I mean, it would take someone with superhuman intelligence and interest, such as yourself, to have like that ability to code switch between the world of technology, which has a very different cultural paradigmatic thought process, as well as medicine. You kind of hinted like medicine may have some parallels with the military, for example. Like, I mean, there are physicians out there in the world that can do that, but I don't know if there's a lot of them. And they have to do so much, and they come out into their mid-30s with hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. So is it because of the system that we have a realistic expectation that physicians can really take this on? So is there a little bit of like maybe putting more on the plates of physicians and trainees that already have too much on their plate? Or do you really see that there's an area in that process of getting to become a doctor where they really could bring in some med tech training, if you will?
I think that, okay, first off, to validate what you're saying, yes, doctors are 100% victimized right now. I have nothing but compassion for clinicians, especially with COVID and the way the industry is going. They're being overworked. They're being shamed whenever they fall short, and they are not getting the help that they need. Like, there's the external help is not pouring in, and by that I mean, when was the last time you felt a lawyer was your friend? Like, most doctors, when I mentioned that lawsuit, they don't even consider the fact that they would have a friend in law, somebody with compassion for them, fighting for them. So, it's not just that, it's a lawyer, a computer engineer. There's a lot of isolation going on in medicine. And there's a culture of overwork, and it's bred into us from the time before we even start medicine. Most of us are overachievers, and working really hard and, trying to be the top of our class and all that before we even start. And then once you're in, there's this culture of, oh, we've selected you above all these other people. You have to give everything now back to us. And doctors are just depleted. So the way I see it is two things. First up, there is a large number of physicians leaving the profession right now, way
Yes.
more than there should be, because the profession has become very inhospitable. Those physicians need somewhere to go, and they need somewhere to go where they're not going to lose all of their income and where they're going to get a bit of a break. So I'm not saying high tech is an easier lifestyle. It can be, just as many hours as medicine, but it is a cognitive break. And sometimes physicians just need that time to recover. I've worked with Pamela Bible, who works with the physician suicide. A lot of residents leave training. And I think that there needs to be a culture of like, here's a safe place to go where you can do something that helps medicine and uses your career and it's still well funded. And you're adding value to the profession and you're welcome back when you're ready. So there's this idea of like, once a physician leaves, they can never come back. And I think that we need more, we need a safe place for these physicians to go when they feel burnt out and when they just can't do it anymore. So that's the first thing. A lot of trainees do leave for technology, and they could come back, but we don't really let them. And that's because we don't have a specialty for them. If a trainee needs a year off and they go and work on drug development, we don't bat an eyelash. It's a little bit on the other side, but we think, okay, well, you're doing something related to medicine. Maybe you're going to bring back some lab skills. Maybe they work in an academic career or something. I know lots of physicians who did that and it was encouraged. So, and we do have clinical technologist training programs. They're not clinical informatics training programs, but they're not technologist training programs. So these forays into device development and stuff, that doesn't really happen in medicine. It does happen at like Stanford. The professors can leave for a year. They retain all their academic tenure. They go and found a startup and then they go back and they do it about once every 5 years. You see it because that's that's an academic institution heavily embedded in Silicon Valley. So it's not discouraged. It's considered beneficial. Stanford retains some of the rights to these devices. So we could have a culture like that where there was a chance to get a break. That's the first one. And then the second one is, I don't think it's a totally separate skill set. It's not fair to ask physicians to go train more. And I think most physicians think when they hear this, oh my God, I have to go train more. No, what I'm asking physicians to do is to realize that something's wrong. Something's really wrong. If we're this burnt out, if we're this overworked, if people are being this uncompassionate to our lived lives, to our lifestyle, and our ability to answer the phone at all hours of the night, and just basic human needs, something's wrong. And we need to take a stop and stop working harder and start working smarter. And that starts with realizing what's actually happening. And what's actually happening is the software is way below industry grade, and it's not going to stop unless we take a different approach. And once again, complaining or burning out or leaving the profession is not the smartest thing to do. The smartest thing to do is realize where to take a stand and then organize to take a stand. And it doesn't have to be, I'm recommending a class action because it's easy for physicians to assign numbers and they can sign up for a class action without putting in their individual names. They just have to give enough numbers to where they can attract a large legal firm. And a mass tort is where you have to put your name in and say, this is my personal name and this is the amount it cost me personally. So I advocated for that structure because I thought it could be a uniting principle, and then later on it could transfer to more political action. I do agree with Eric Topol that physicians absolutely need to unite, and they've been balkanized. And a lot of that is this kind of internalized shame, overwork, stress, responsibility, and it can be crushing.
I mean, I love that answer. There's so many different offshoots there. I mean, one of the things was, for those that don't know, I was actually thinking about a clinical informatics sort of secondary fellowship before I did GI. And, I thought there were some really committed people there. I was somewhat sort of surprised at least from my limited experience at the time, that a lot of the work was just on, minor tweaks to the EMR, but like the major areas in which humans, physicians interact with technology, especially in the way that you sort of eloquently articulated, wasn't part of the culture and the research there. It was like, okay, this is what Epic has given us, and then we can do some academic papers on how to optimize the pop-up and limit alert fatigue, but you're like mowing the lawn when the house is on fire, it seemed to me. And I was like, I want more revolutionary changes here. I think incremental approach isn't going to suffice for the nature of the problem, the scope of the problem that we're at. So I'll ask you the question that you kind of already answered directly and indirectly, but just to put a specific spin on it. One of my central arguments about physicians is that they don't have a resiliency deficit. I mean, you have some of the most resilient professionals on the planet that have done crazy amounts of work under quite literally life and death circumstances for years. So why is it that this group in particular that is so resilient is, at least verbalizing leaving the field or going part-time, and numbers suggest that. And I might add, will include certainly nurses, NPs, and, additional professionals. But what is it simply this, just, inhospitable sort of EMR and work culture? Is it reimbursement? Is it shifting changes with how care is being delivered? Is it regulatory uncertainty? I mean, every time I ask someone that question, I always get a slightly different answer. So why is the average sort of frontline clinician in most specialties leaving? Because I mean, I'll be honest with you, like I have a lot of physician friends, and nearly all of them have on some level of seriousness expressed an interest to reduce their hours, go part-time, leave the field. I had one friend who said recently, shall remain nameless, where I'm just looking for an exit. Once I get that exit strategy, when that portal opens, not because they don't want to take care of patients. I want to make that very clear, but it's because of some of these things. So in your estimation, to put a specific point on it, why do you think there is such a problem in burnout that is qualitatively worse than similar fields and non-clinical professions?
Yeah, so I train in rural Canada. So I mostly train with family physicians. I was in a rural and remote training program in the north. So the physicians were from like South Africa, India. A lot of them were immigrants and the top clinicians in their field, and they were embedded in small towns. So it'd be a town of like, a few thousand people with one doctor. And the relationship between the doctor and the town was very holistic. Like, people wouldn't call the doctor at night because we only have one doctor. We don't want him to leave. And so, and then, he would go and make house calls sometimes, and he'd be at deathbeds and he'd be at births. And, it was just very like personal relationship. And these guys have been in their practice for like 20, 30 years. And so, and they didn't seem to be burnt out. If anything, they felt very respected and needed in their community. And I would contrast that to the way that I've seen some of the hospitalists treated, for example, in big US hospitals, where it's just, they come onto the ward and it's just another name and nobody knows who they are. And, they give an order and it's, they're more of an icon than an actual like personal identity. And I think a lot of physicians, what keeps them there is patients, patient relationships, longitudinal care, interesting clinical decisions, all the stuff that really gives us, that took us to training and through training, all that stuff. We're losing that when it comes to this big, confusing interface that's in the middle of everything we do and that has no meaning for us. If you look at like a lot of the thought leaders in human computer interaction design, a lot of it was done back in the 60s when computers were first invented. These are people who are metacognition. They had metacognition. In other words, the ability to think about thinking while they were doing it, which is an unusual ability. It's like a threshold IQ. Most doctors have it. When you're writing a note if you're tired, and you can kind of compensate for that tiredness. So physicians develop metacognition a lot of times in residency training. You can't make an error, but your personal ability to think is fluctuating extensively, so you're compensating for it. That's metacognition. And so physicians are aware of the impact on their thinking, and also they're incredibly intelligent human beings. They can see this system and they realize, okay, the system is much bigger than I am, and it's not going to change without a radical shift. And without the skills to put that lever, what did they say? If I have a big enough lever, I can move the world.
Yeah.
A big enough lever and a place to stand, it can move the world. Yeah. And I think that most actors, even if they see a lever like this class action that I'm suggesting, which is just one option, there's other options. Where am I going to stand?
I mean,
You know?
that, I'll ask the immediate follow-up question because I loved that answer, which is, where is the home for the new physician who is trying to do what you're describing, which is speak to the holistic needs of a patient and his or her community, along with the desire to innovate in a rapidly technologically changing field. And I'll point to what you said earlier in the interview, which is, this is an inhospitable work environment for providers, and that we're considered cogs. Honestly, one of the biggest heartbreaks for me came when that feeling that I am just in some system and that I am basically a very elaborately trained technician of the body that is commoditized, despite medical school being filled with white coat ceremonies and, meaningful, you know, exhortations to the nobility of what we do. The system doesn't see us that way. And when I kind of had that realization early in my residency in internal medicine, I sort of like, I was so moved negatively. I almost had like this moment of breaking down in the hospital. And so I guess, where is the home for the physician? The healthcare system right now sees us as commoditized labor that they're trying to price reduce because, we're an expensive line item for a chief medical officer or a private equity firm. I've talked to a fair number of people in the startup space in digital health, whether they're innovators themselves or people who are running funding at an angel level or venture capitalistic. They basically have the same view of physicians. Like, hey, you guys are just a necessary part of this sort of novel way of disrupting your industry. We're going to move fast and break things, and we just happen to need you right now. So we only tolerate you insofar as you can fit into our Python designed, ML scheme, where we're going to revolutionize what you already do. And I've had some people who've made the shift from clinical work to digital medicine to escape burnout, only to run into the same professional lack of, appreciation for what we offer. So is it going to have to be physicians creating their own sort of hybrid setup where they're able to sort of not go from bench to bedside, but from like computer terminal to bedside, where they're able to do these sorts of things? Because it seems like as long as there's money and power, and there's a lot of money and power in healthcare, and increasingly more so, there are going to be entities that value and want their share of the pie. And they just see physicians as a gatekeeping role to get what they want, as opposed to them intrinsically being valued for what they do, which is provide, hopefully healing for people. So where's the home for the future physician who is trying to do what you are describing, which is create a novel technological system, take care of patients, find a way to do this better, work smart, not work hard?
Yeah. It's a tough one. That one of the reasons why I advocate legal action is I don't think that you have to have protection. There needs to be protection first. I always think of physicians as like cartilage cells. I did tissue engineering research on one of my many forays for a year. We were trying to figure out how to re-engineer cartilage. And if you look at a cartilage cell, it's a slow growing cell. It's surrounded by a matrix. It's kind of like within a matrix. And when the joint becomes inhospitable, all of a sudden all these cartilage cells start dying off, but they don't regrow fast. And so if you think about medicine and doctors, it's the same way that you make a joint healthy again, something that's totally inflamed from rheumatoid arthritis. You need to take out the inflammatory characteristics. You need to protect the cartilage cells that remain, and you need to give it time to regrow. So I think one of the things physicians can do is advocate very strongly for bedside medicine. That's one area where nobody can touch a physician. I really admire Abraham Verghese's work at Stanford and his Bedside Medicine 25 initiative, where
Yeah.
he just really, really drills down and he's stuck on it, and he's really, really been strong on it. And I think physicians have a place there. The more that we advocate for bedside medicine, the less likely we are to be commoditized and treated as a cog, because that's not something that you can commoditize. On any front, you can't commoditize it as a hospital administrator, and you can't commoditize it as a tech developer. The second thing is, I think physicians need to open that door. That door is locked right now. There's lots of really good tech developers. I mean, it's the software that you use on your iPhone. You have a choice. I think on my iPhone right now, I'm just looking at it, I probably have about 50 different apps. If I don't like an app, I can delete it. And I use a suite of probably 5 or 6 apps routinely, but they're developed by completely different companies. And it works for me because, my cognitive footprint works with these particular apps. Physicians don't have that, but that is there. It's been designed. It's called the Harvard Smart Platform.
Mhm. Yeah.
And basically physicians could crack Epic open and make it like the Harvard Smart Platform. There's a few legal levers there because although Epic has decided that they own the interface, there's no real reason why they should be creating the interface for every specialty. And part of the big problem with the cognitive environment is that every specialty is trying to use basically the same app, and it's not working. If they made it so that they could start bringing in these different elements. So there is software out there that's not running on your hospital interface, and it's super easy to hand. So I'm going to give 3 examples that I think are good tech developed by doctors for doctors with a clinical mindset. And the first one is ShareSmart, developed by Dr. Justin Young out of Canada. It's a photo sharing app that's HIPAA secure. So you can take photographs in the hospital, share with other doctors and your patients. And it's got all the controls that you'd want as a clinician. It's available on your cell phone. Most doctors are using their cell phone to take photos, whether they ever admit it publicly. So it protects you, and then you can use it. The second one, you can also manage patient databases of photos, etc. Second one is List Runner. It's developed by Jishan Chowdhury. I think he was a resident in internal medicine, and he started to get like a little bit worried about the paper list that everybody carries around, all the residents carry, and all the patients need to take all your notes. So he created a very usable HIPAA secure interface. You can put it on your phone or your computer. Any residents group could adopt it immediately. It's entirely easy. And the third one is HealthPop, which I helped launch in 2014, I think. And a lot of physicians who are family docs or have their own private practice can have a telemedicine practice, 10% of the time in order to optimize. So there's this stuff out there that does make your life easier. The question is do you know about it? And if it's created, how does it get into your clinical environment? And once again, that comes out of the cartilage cell. How do these soothing treatments penetrate through this matrix that doctors are locked in, which is inhospitable, as I said, as we both said.
I mean, I love that answer, that sort of biological metaphor for that. I thought it was really kind of interesting, and initially I didn't understand the Abraham Verghese reference because he, for those that don't know, is sort of a well-known physician author, and at least maybe apocryphally you would know because you were at Stanford. I had friends that had done medicine there would say he would round super early in the morning at like 5 or something or 6, even before morning labs had returned, simply to emphasize that you can make decisions regarding patients just based on their physical exam and their history of present illness without the need to rely on all this technological apparatus. So I don't know. I met him a few times. I didn't have a lot of interaction. I wouldn't say that he's a Luddite, but he definitely has sort of a throwback mentality when it comes to the patient physician interactions. I thought that was interesting given that you're so pro technologist, but then going back doing research on you have such a spiritual and sort of personal side with your work in yoga and doing all these sort of alternative paths, although yoga isn't all that alternative anymore. So I thought, well, yeah, actually that does make sense that you would resonate with that desire to sort of blend what would be seemingly contradictory interests into sort of one path. So that's one of the things I love about kind of your interests. So then I guess the question then is this a challenge of technology or is this a challenge of leverage, power, of money, and status? One of the things that I often argue, and maybe I'm wrong, feel free to correct me, is when you look at all the stakeholders at the proverbial table in healthcare, the government, insurance, payer systems, integrated healthcare networks, academic medical centers, big pharma, biomed device, patient and patient advocacy groups, nonprofits, and then physicians. Some regard, I would say that, physicians are the weakest in terms of our leverage. And one kind of sad example that I came across personally, along with sort of in the news, was when COVID first hit and we didn't have PPE. And I know I was palpably worried for myself as a GI doctor. I was going to the unit, scoping these patients that were bleeding. They need feeding tubes, all kinds of stuff. And I kept hearing, oh, well, you signed up for this to go in with no protective equipment and deal with and that was all over the news. And it was sort of like a weird sort of thing where, doctors in New York are getting hand claps at 7 at night, but there's a wide group of Americans, I don't know how big, maybe a large minority or a significant plurality of people that said, this is what you do. You're supposed to do this now, shut up or put up or something. And so I thought, wow, was really hurtful, actually. I felt really bad about that. But I thought it also speaks to like how conflicted sometimes our country is about how they treat providers. So one of the themes that I picked up that I was kind of wondering about all of your interesting insights was, is this a technology problem and we need technology training? I mean, on some level, you've certainly clearly articulated that. Or is it also, we don't have political leverage. We don't have enough money. We don't have enough physicians owning and running hospitals to the degree that the federal government and laws allow. I mean, there are some studies that show physician-oriented and physician-run hospitals have better clinical outcomes than similar facilities run by suits, if you will. I mean, is this really that we need technology training in a sort of plethora of other skills that need to be developed, but is it really more of a leverage issue? Or do you think, no, this is a technology problem that can be fixed primarily with technological interventions?
It's a design problem. And design means that you need to know, you need a sharp knife, and you need to know exactly where to cut. Just to give a surgery metaphor, which was my love when I was in training. So doctors need a sharp knife, and I think what I've given them is a pretty sharp knife. And I've given it from the other perspective, from the tech end, from the legal end, from doing my research on what's really sharp, what's pointy on the other end, and then where to cut. And where to cut is, you want to cut in a way that doctors like Abraham Verghese, who focus on clinical care, we need to take back our right to have a personal, meaningful, hands-on, kinesthetic relationship with our patients. That's what gives us the meaning. That's what we want. That's what we need to cut to preserve. So we need to carve out time for that, because we're never going to be happy if we don't have it. That's what makes it us happy. And then we also need to slice through the clinical technology that's available to us and say, this serves me and this doesn't. This makes my life easier and this doesn't. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is if we stop being balkanized. The problem, the core problem, I think, with our profession is that we, at least when it comes to selecting candidates, we compete to get into medicine. And then in medical training, we compete with each other. And the competitive energy we retain into our later practice. So we feel isolated and we can't join together meaningfully. And I think that's why you see other groups having more power at the table. If you look at, I want to call out nurses and just say that I really think that in general, they tend to organize better than physicians do. They seem to make collective bargaining a lot more seamlessly. And if we learned from them and we were able to drop the competition and start working together, I don't think that anybody would be able to stand up to the voice that physicians bring. And I don't think we need to be at the table talking all the time. That's not what we do. We just need to have a coordinated voice when we speak. And we also need to know what to ask for, because right now we're all asking for different things. Everybody's kind of fighting each other. If you look at the more toxic a hospital system, the more likely it is that the different disciplines have all kinds of feuds going on inside the hospital system, and that makes it impossible for them to see their collective problem. I hope I'm saying this properly.
No, I 100% agree. I mean, in fact, it was very similar to what Topol referenced in that New York article. This will all be in the show notes. Was, yeah, physician advocacy groups, medical professional societies are very siloed, and there ends up being a level of infighting and a very provincial almost level of focus in what they talk about, as opposed to these larger, broad-scale issues that are going on in the industry that are making physicians unhappy or putting patients at risk. I want to switch to like sort of the last component of the interview in a direction I thought that would be slightly away from technology and more to some of the holistic elements of what we do in this field. And I thought Dr. Verghese is sort of a classic reference to that. So, I mean, he, again, for those that don't know, well-known physician, internist, and author, wrote, I think, The Tennis Partner and Cutting for Stone or Cutting on Stone, but these great pieces. Full disclosure, I haven't read fully both of those books, but I've read an extensive selection from both. And one of the things that he was sort of able to pick up on in like in the mid to early 70s or 80s, because he was practicing in the Midwest. He was seeing a plethora of, men who had sex with men, in their middle-aged years, coming to the Midwest to frankly die. And at the time, no one knew why, but they had these sort of massive immune deficiencies and changes in their white cell. And only later did it become clear, oh, there's this new virus, HIV, and there's these consequences that are killing people. And I think there obviously are overt parallels to what we're going through now. But the reason I mentioned him in context with you is we were talking before the show, like, I don't think I've met anyone, at least virtually or in person in recent memory, that has such a wide, eclectic range of interests. And it seems like you've gotten to develop yourself personally and maybe even emotionally and spiritually with your interest in yoga. I know you wrote a book on that. You're in the Amazon right now. You have such a pro-social thought process. You've done things with technology, delinquent savants. You had a prevention pod. And I thought, well, you kind of have a lot of parallels with, Dr. Verghese in terms of your desire to pick up on, these sort of larger narratives about what's going on in our society. And, how a physician used to be a bellwether. You kind of reference that with your training in rural Canada, where like, oh, this physician is part of this healing community. We're not just a technician of the body that has encounters with consumers, and we're just healthcare providers that bill for insurance. So, I mean, if I had to ask you to wax philosophical about like, where is medicine going? Where's our society going? I mean, we have an increasingly sick society filled with excess, physicians burning out, struggling to keep patients healthy. Our patients are increasingly more comorbid, usually with chronic disease, but certainly in the last 2 years, the complications of an acute pathogen. And I think there's a crisis of meaning. You're kind of speaking to that, really. You're saying there's a crisis of meaning, if you will, within the healthcare ranks. A lot of it driven by the factors you've outlined so brilliantly in this show. But I think there's also a crisis of meaning in our society. And I thought, as someone that has done meaning exploration, to use that term, if you had to kind of put your 2 cents on kind of where we are in all of this, and you can define that question however you like, I'm really fascinated to know like what your take on the state of affairs are kind of right now.
Okay, so I got very influenced by other systems of medicine. I was trained in Western medicine, and I thought that was going to be my bellwether, and I was just going to always do that. And then when I left residency, I started to look at other healthcare systems, specifically indigenous, Ayurvedic, and traditional Chinese medicine. These are systems that have been around for 5,000 years. Where I'm at in the Amazon, they were smelting platinum at the same time Europeans were. And when the Spaniards showed up, they took all of their technology and they took it off to the jungle. And at first they told the Europeans about rubber plants, but that didn't go so well for them. If you look at the history of rubber plantations here. So they just said, you know what, we're not going to tell you about the rest of our stuff. The shaman that I work with 5,000 different plant formulations, and they live in their communities almost exactly the way I described Western physicians living in Canada, which is as part of the community, as a leader, and as this more esoteric role, which is and there's a book by a German anthropologist that I call it's called Shaman Healers and Medicine Men. And he researched pretty much every indigenous healer around the world, like Australia, Northern Europe, South America, and he correlated their different reports of being a healer. And I found that to be, I read it at one period in my training, and I found it to be so healing when I found a kind of a name and a theme for what I was in the community, which is definitely more than just a visit. The role of a doctor is super esoteric, and it has been throughout centuries and throughout all of human history. And I think that we need to own that. We need to own that esotericism in a way. In many ways, Western medicine has abdicated it. I work with a group of death doulas that work in the southern U.S., and I also work with an esoteric shaman out of Egypt, and they both are working in the death industry, and talking about this kind of gatekeeper role, which is very liminal. And it doesn't have to be religious, but it is liminal. And doctors have access to this. And there is something powerful about that. And people need to access a healer in other ways than just they need to access a healer for medicine for healing, and they need to access somebody who's encountered death in order to like help them cope with it. One of my good friends, their one of their parents just died,
Oh,
and they brought up for the first time that, I guess I don't really think about death. And I thought, oh, I think about death all the time just because it's kind of like my job. But to have that ability is so meaningful in a society. And I once again, I'm just going to use a metaphor because I'm a poet, so I think a lot of metaphor. But when I think of doctors in the U.S., I think of white blood cells in the midst of a severe infection and them dying off in numbers, and like and then all the and I actually HIV comes to mind a lot, because if you look at it as a society, we're killing them for healers first, and that's exactly how the particular disease of HIV happens. Is
yeah.
they kill off the disease fighting entities first, and doctors are disease fighting entities, like in and of ourselves, and we are trained in the same way that B cells are trained and selected, to be non-antigenic and to not harm other people. And we're, all of our training trains us to be white blood cells. So I think particularly B cells, but that's my pick. In that metaphor, I think maybe I'd be a follicular dendritic cell, but I think about nobody really gets that metaphor except for the doctors.
That's right.
Um, yeah, I I think sometimes our in the U.S., maybe the entire body of the U.S., if you think of every person listening to cell, maybe has diabetes or HIV right now. And when I think about like how to fight it, it's the same way that you would fight diabetes or HIV, which is um by working with white blood cells and working with infection.
I
Maybe
love
that's
that answer. I
me
mean,
too.
I thought that was really quite interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think that I mean, I've said it before in this show, and I 100% agree. I mean, I think for a lot of people, COVID was the first time that, the finitude of life was really put in their face. And I think that for non-clinicians, which, as you said, it's our job to do this kind of work, dealing with people that are, dying or will soon die, which isn't to say I think it's any easier for us. I mean, it hasn't gotten any easier for me, but I think that at least there's a basic familiarity. I thought it was a painful wake up call for a lot of the world. And I think we're seeing the emotional after effects with all the sort of stuff that's happening to people in our shared public spaces in terms of how people are acting and behaving, dealing with this sort of traumatization of this inexperience with death. So I want to bring these sort of two threads back together if I can, because one of the things that Eric Topol, also a technologist and cardiologist here in California has argued is that AI may be able to allow physicians to occupy a better healing role by depressurizing, deloading some of that, more routine, perfunctory clinical administrative work that fills up the vast majority of our days but isn't high value. And so he, in that regard, is a techno optimist. But in some of your pieces, you maybe hinted, maybe I'm wrong, that if we're not careful and we don't take a hand on the steering wheel, that may not happen. But AI would be the next iteration of the current EMR debacle that we have, and theoretically drive even more physicians to have the negative consequences and the burnout and disillusionment about their healing work that you've kind of argued. So where is there a happy balance between these two views? I mean, are both options viable right now? Does it feel like your vision for what AI can do and machine learning going to play out, or is Topol right? No, this could be the iteration that actually allows people to act like that rural physician that the town really connected with, and can help heal our society and be attorneys for the poor, which was the old historical description of how physicians are supposed to act. I mean, so how do we look at AI with regards to these sorts of trends?
Wow. Okay. I love that attorneys for the poor. Um, the word shaman is Germanic, and it signifies one who knows. And I think we do know. In many ways, we do know what to do. We need to take our role back to just say what AI is going to do for us. And however we do that, there's this brilliant essay which I go back to all the time. It's written by Linkletter. He was the man in the middle of the Pentagon during the Cold War when they invented computers, and they were designing the computers to fight the Soviets. and everybody, it was all very serious. And he was this like super esoteric genius. And he just wrote this beautiful little essay called Man Computer Symbiosis. And he's like, I'm a thinking man. Here's what I think about. He's like, here's what I think could be delegated to a machine. And if a machine thought about this instead, it would make my life easier. And I think that in many ways, doctors can do that, you know, and I think it's a fun, optimistic cognitive exercise to think, okay, here's not what I have, but here's what I need. Here's what's going to make me, here's what's going to give me more time with my patients. Here's the thinking that I'm willing to delegate and that I could easily delegate. And then start thinking about that, start designing that, and then share it with people. You can email it to any machine learning professor anywhere and just flood them with emails and say, this is what I want to delegate. There's no reason why this information can't be transmitted out, and you don't have to make the machine learning, you know, the esoteric principles of how it's made is much less relevant than the cognitive task that's being asked to do.
I mean, I love that. I mean, I think that, we're not designing code, we need to design our lives. So I love that. I love that
Yes.
physicians are going to have to like take that initiative, which is kind of anti-militaristic because there are parallels, as you pointed out, be a little bit willing to, you know, break orthodoxy, which is kind of what you've been remarkable at. So I know we're coming up on time. I really wish we had time to talk about Impulse and then the Prevention Pause and your To Dream a Life consulting firm. But to end the interview, and I definitely would love to have you back when you're free and available for a part two. I mean, if you had to give one message, because there's a large percentage of, my audience that are actively in healthcare in both academic community practice. There's a lot of tech entrepreneurs who listen to the show and startup consultants. Like, if you had one message regarding all this, maybe a reiteration of all the great insights you've dropped, what do people need to know that they really just don't get, that your time in the literal and metaphorical forests of the world, what do they need to understand to make the next iteration of med tech work for these healing purposes? Because I see you as bringing back Prometheus's fire. You've made that reference, I think, very accurately in some of your pieces. You're on the return of that sort of hero's journey, right? I see you as sort of like a Cassandra. Cassandra, is, for those that don't know, was this prophet, but was never believed, right? Like that was her curse, is that she had the gift for foresight, but the curse to not be believed. And I want this show, along with your other works, to kind of change that. So what do we need to get in all of us, in that ilk that we don't yet, about what technology can do to kind of, to help us? How do we get back on track?
Well, two things. First off, I think every clinician should read the paper on the Harvard Smart platform. It doesn't take that long. It's a short scan. And once you know what to ask for, yeah, then drill down on that in whatever way possible. Number one. Number two, a personal story. So when I was in my first foray into Silicon Valley, I interviewed with Dr. Verghese to be the coordinator for his bedside medicine 25 program. And he said, "Why are you here?" And I said, "I am here to make a clinical interface that's better than all the other ones." And he said, "Get out of my office." Basically, it was my worst interview ever by far. And I was so in love with his work. And then actually he was the one that funded the Impulse app. So he did an ethics in AI and medicine symposium. I applied to his program with the Impulse app. This is about 5 years later. It's an app for homelessness. And he said, "This is the best thing I've ever seen in my life." And so there's this turnaround that's happened, and he's one of my mentors. I'm a massive fan of his work, and I think that there is a way for clinicians who love bedside medicine to find tech that they love. And both of us changed. I made my tech more relevant, and he develops an interest in AI, and so we will change. I totally believe doctors are resilient and brilliant, and they love their patients and they love their work, and we will find a way to do it.
I love that. That's such a hopeful, optimistic message. I can't thank you enough for being on the show. I had such a blast. If people want to connect with you, learn about your work, try and participate, join, or just reach out, how can they find you online?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm the only Drea Burbank online. So I'm pretty easy to find. If I do anything, well, more stupid than I've already done, I'll definitely be famous for it. But yes, you can type Drea Burbank in, and then I've got a website. You can find me on LinkedIn. Our consulting company handles hard scientific and social problems, but I do a lot of advocacy outside of that. So yeah, I love doctors. I
I
love all
love it.
clinicians. I give a shout out to the nurses that I worked with too, and the physician's assistants and everything.
Oh, absolutely. I'm such a stand for those professionals. I mean, I think we tend to forget in the medical side, it really is a collaborative enterprise. So thank you for bringing that last point to our attention. So the guest is Dr. Drea Burbank, really future visionary, as well as, healer and yogi, right? I mean, you occupy so many hats. I mean, I'm trying to figure out how to like pithily sum up everything that you've done, but for the purposes of this interview, MD technologist, author, and consultant that's really believing in the power of technology to solve the hard problems of society. So thank you for being on this show, The Alchemy of Politics.
Thank you for having me.